Well, sometimes it just takes someone to step into our lives, to arrive and fix things, to put things right, to put things back in the proper order. And that's what the people were hoping for as Jesus entered Jerusalem. And they were crying out, "Hosanna, save us, get us back to the promises that we were looking for, that we were waiting for. Give us that hope that we've read about, that we've been teaching our sons and daughters for years." As we know, Jesus entered Jerusalem, and it wasn't but maybe a week or so later, and here Christ was hanging on a cross. The cross, the symbol of death, the worst kind of death. When we see that cross, it should remind us of that. But the empty cross should remind us of the hope that we have. But I can't help but thinking as I look at these gospel stories, as I think about that moment myself, of all the people who were onlookers, all the people who saw and were expecting something. They were expecting something from this Messiah. They were expecting something from Jesus. They had seen what he had done in the lives of others. They had heard the things that he was teaching. They had great hopes and great dreams. What were they thinking as they saw him hanging on the cross? Were they thinking that he deserved it? Even those Gentile Romans, those soldiers and the centurion, even they, as they looked at Christ on the cross, they realized he didn't deserve it. Even Pilate said, "This man is innocent, and wash my hands of this." He knew that Jesus didn't deserve it. And yet Jesus stepped into it. He stepped forward. He continued to take our place on the cross. And for all those who were onlookers, who knew that they deserved to be on the cross, what were they thinking? Did they feel that all hope was lost? That this was the end of the line? It's all over? Were they questioning and doubting God? What's God doing? Why is he allowing this to happen? How could he? Where is God in my time of need? Jesus was supposed to be the answer. What was his mother thinking? Mary, who raised him from her womb and who knew that God had this purpose for her son, to save the world from their sins. And yet, he didn't stay on that cross. There was more to the story. This was just the beginning of a new start. God was resetting people's perspectives, helping them to understand and realize that God is at work with something much bigger, much better than what the people originally had thought or expected. But the question for us is, as we come into this season, this time of year, this Holy Week, how do we see Jesus? How do we view him? How do we understand him and what he did? And what difference does that make in our life, in my circumstance, in the situations and the interactions that I'm having with people, in my marriage, in my family, at my workplace? Does Jesus really make a difference? The people were expecting something. The people were declaring something. They were mindful of these old passages. What I find interesting in Matthew 21, right in the first verse, we read that the people drew near and together in Jerusalem with Jesus, and they were in Bethphage at the Mount of Olives. Now, I know that might not mean too much to you. You just might think that it's a name and that it's a place. And it certainly is a name and a place. But those names, those places, have some significance. They have some meaning. And as they were gathered, the people were mindful. They were thoughtful. They were beginning to see, who is this Jesus? What are the things that he's doing? He just raised Lazarus. Lazarus, remember his friend, the brother of Martha and Mary? He lived in Bethphage. They saw him raised from the dead. He was dead a few weeks ago, and now he's alive, and here Jesus is again. What is going on? Is this Jesus really the Messiah? Is this Jesus, this guy from Nazareth, that he's truly a prophet, he speaks the things of the Lord, is he really the promised one of Israel, who's going to make everything right, who's going to put things the way that God intended it? Was this the one of their promised hope? Well, if you want, you can go ahead and turn to Isaiah chapter 11. Isaiah chapter 11, we read one of the core prophecies about this Jesus. At the end of the passage, the people were declaring, as people were asking, who is this man? Who's this guy riding on the donkey? The people who knew, they declared, he is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth, or Nazareth. And Nazareth, if you're familiar with the Hebrew language, it means a shoot, or a little sprout up of a plant that's just beginning. It's just starting up. It's a natzer. It's a little sprout. And if you were to hear that word or that phrase, if you were to understand the meaning of that, and you would put into context, where have I heard that before? You would go back to this. This is one of the main passages, Isaiah chapter 11. There shall come forth a shoot, or a little sprout, and that's there, from the stump of Jesse. And a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. So right here we see that this shoot, this sprout, this natzer, coming from the stump of Jesse, he's going to branch forth from the roots of Jesse, and he's going to bear much fruit. Right here we see there's this connection to the Messiah. He's going to be sprouting forth. He's going to be producing fruit. He's going to be filled with the Spirit. The hand of the Lord is going to be upon him. He's not going to decide things as we decide things, but he's going to decide things by what is true and righteous. So as the people in Jerusalem began declaring this about Jesus, that he's God's Savior, that he's the Messiah, these concepts and expectations and ideas are beginning to sprout out. And then it shifts in the passage, and we begin to see the hope of the future when this Messiah and this King is ruling and reigning. And the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and the calf with the lion, and the fattened calf together, and the little child shall lead them. The cow and the bear shall graze together. Their young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox. The nursing child shall play over the hole of the cobra, and the weaned child shall put his hand in the adder's den. And they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord, as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root or the sprout of Jesse, who shall stand as a signal for the peoples, of him shall the nations inquire, and his resting place shall be glorious. In that day, the Lord will extend his hand yet a second time to recover the remnant that remains of his people. You've maybe heard this before with the phrase, the lion will lie down with the lamb. You've heard that phrase, right? Now that's a phrase that pastors and whoever have put together. This passage actually never says the lion will lie down with the lamb, but it's that vision, it's that idea. It says the lion is going to eat grass and straw right next to the ox. It says that the leopards that would usually chase down and run down the lambs, the young goats, they're going to lie down together. The calf is going to be with the lion. They're going to get fattened up together. They're going to be together. And so it's this idea that these forces that would otherwise be contrary to one another, that would otherwise consume one another, there's going to be peace. So much peace that you can just not even worry about your little kids. Your little toddlers, you can just let them go, and they'll be able to play amongst the snakes. And they're not going to be harmed. Now, if I were to tell you that this is a reality, that this will be the outcome of when the Messiah comes, wouldn't you look forward to that day? There's going to be no more pain. There's going to be no more sorrow. There's going to be no more disease. There's going to be no more suffering. There's going to be no more wars. The Jewish people were looking forward to that. And now the Messiah had arrived. But yet they didn't quite understand the end of this passage. It says, in that day, and then again a verse later it says, in that day. It gives two declarations. It says, first, in that day, this sprout of Jesse is going to come. This root of Jesse is going to be established, and he's going to be a signal for the peoples of the nations. And everyone should inquire about him and about his glorious resting place. What's the implication? The implication of this verse is that this message about the Messiah is going to go forth to the nations, and the nations are going to ask and inquire and wonder about him, and this message needs to go forth because everyone around the world is going to need to discover about his glorious resting place. Well, that's what we're looking forward to next Sunday. We're going to celebrate his glorious resting place, that he was crucified, buried, and dead for 3 days and 3 nights, and yet he rose again. This is the message that needs to get declared. And then it says, in that day, in that future day when God's going to make all this happen, the Lord will then extend his hand, and yet for a second time he will recover his remnant. So there's a first day when Jesus is going to come, and he's going to die, he's going to be buried, and then his message is going to need to go out to the nations so that people everywhere will want to hear about his glorious burial and resurrection. That his once resting place is now an empty tomb. And then, in that day, there's going to be another day that's going to come when the Lord is going to return, and he's going to extend his hand, and he's going to bring, and he's going to recover the remnant, those who believe, that group of people who believe in Jesus Christ a second time. Now, what we have to realize and understand that I think many of those first observers missed is this hope and this promise of the Messiah didn't all happen just back in that day. But only half of this was fulfilled. We don't see the lions grazing with the ox. We don't see the leopards lying down with the baby goats. That hope, that future fulfillment is yet to come in the eternal kingdom. But right now, we need to understand that all hope is still not lost. That stump of Jesse, that little sprout, has sprung forth, and he shall bear fruit. And he wants his disciples, you and I, to bear much fruit, so that the nations will hear, so that people all around the world would inquire about that glorious resting place. Why should people care about that glorious resting place? Because just like the cross is empty, that tomb is what? Empty. That glorious resting place of the Messiah is empty because he overcame sin and death. And that's just the first part of the promise, that we can find hope, that his teachings and the things that he declared and that he showed his people as good and true, that his His judgments are just, and that He is bringing righteousness, and that we can follow His lead and His teachings in these things. And that as we begin to align ourselves with His will and ways, He will, in the future, bring that peace that we can look forward to. But until that day, we need to understand something. We need to understand that why did Jesus come to Bethphage? Why did He come to the Mount of Olives? Why is this prophecy about this little shoot that's sprouting forth? It's just beginning. It's just a new start of a growth. And yet the hope is that much fruit would be bore. Well, I don't know if you like dates, but I love dates. And this is a date palm. In this picture, you can see the size of a date palm tree compared to a car there. But usually, it takes date palm trees about 10 years before they really can produce fruit. It's not a very quick process. It kind of takes a long time. And what I like about the visual and about the picture of a date palm tree, is that you can see a lot of time has passed. A lot of time has passed in the life of this date palm tree, and here it is now finally producing some fruit. Well, what happened over the course of those years? There's many years that had to occur, fertilizing, development, growth. It had to weather many storms, and yet eventually it does produce fruit. Well, here is a picture of an olive tree. This particular olive tree is about 3,000 years old. It's in Crete. It's not my picture. I was just reading about it as I was trying to find out what are some of the oldest olive trees that are alive. But the thing that I even discovered about olive trees in Israel is that sometimes these big, old, nasty, ugly, weathered, they look like they're half-dead olive trees, you can graft in new sprouts to them, or every now and again, they'll even just sprout a new sprout. And you can see in this olive tree, you can kind of see where the two big branches kind of got cut off, and now you got some smaller branches growing off the top of it. That sometimes these big, old, gnarly things that look half dead, even things that have been existing for 3,000 years, can give off new sprouts and new branches and produce fruit. God's purpose is not done with even the old, gnarly olive trees that think there's no more good that can come out of that thing. This is one of my favorites. What kind of tree do you guys think this one is? Well, if you knew what Bethphage meant, Bethphage means house of the early fig. House of the early fig. This is a fig tree. Number of years ago, I bought a fig tree. How shall I say? I'm not like maybe a real good, consistent gardener, but when I see some plant that is unique and fun, I'm like all in. And I was at this plant show, and they were selling a fig tree. And much to my wife's chagrin, I bought the fig tree, which was great as the summer was here, and it was growing, and fig trees, they just they explode. Their leaves, each individual leaf is like about that big. It's about as big as your head. And they produce fruit pretty fast. That first year that I had that fig tree, it produced fruit. It might have been a couple of years old by that time. I don't know how old it was. I just bought it in a pot, and I got some figs off it, and it was awesome. And then winter was coming, and I knew that fig tree would not survive outside, so I brought it inside. And as it came inside, even in that winter time, it just kept growing and growing. And my wife kept getting more and more annoyed. She didn't like that I had this giant fig tree. It just kept growing and going. And then at a certain time, all the leaves fell off, and I thought I'd killed it. And yet, then in the springtime again, it started getting all these new shoots, and it was getting bigger and bigger. And Ann said, well, I know that you had a lot of fun with this fig tree and such, but why don't you give it to somebody who will appreciate it much more than I do? And so I said, all right. We don't have a great spot for it in our house, so we gave it to some of our friends. And it kept growing and growing on them. They couldn't believe how big it was getting, and I think it finally got too big for them to have in their house, and they finally gave it away as well. I don't know where it's ended up now, but what I love about the fig trees is how they just get so much growth and just become so bushy and so many branches and so much fruit. And when I see these passages about this sprout, this little shoot shooting forth, it makes me mindful of these things. Now in particular, it's often tied, that phrase, anatzera, little shoot, is often tied to just the olive tree. But this concept of a little branch shooting forth and producing much fruit that is talked about in Isaiah chapter 11, when linked, Isaiah chapter 11 is often linked with Matthew 21, with these passages talking about the city of the early fig tree, and Jesus was there on the Mount of Olives. My mind just began to go to this place of these trees of Israel, and God's promise that he was going to make Israel fruitful, that he was going to multiply them. And it's not just the people that he was going to make fruitful and multiply, but it was this message of the gospel that it was going to go forth to the nations. It wasn't just for the Jewish people that this promise applied, but it was for people of all nations. And if you've ever seen a fig tree, it's just covered with just bundles and bundles of figs. And if you've ever seen an olive tree, when it comes to harvest time, don't taste one fresh off the tree. I'll just warn you. Fresh olives are not tasty. Let them be processed first. You'll feel like you have a mouthful of oil if you eat one, from experience. And then these date palm trees, just there's thousands and thousands of dates on these date palm trees, that God wants us to be fruitful. This message that we've come to hear and understand about who is Jesus, it's not just to be excited for us that Jesus came, that he died, that he saved us, that he made a difference in our lives, but he wants us to be fruitful with this message and to share it with others. Because others too need to know the hope that can be had, the hope that is yet to come in Jesus Christ. That hope. You see, that day when Jesus rode in on a donkey, it just wasn't some cute little marketing ploy that Jesus decided, hey, let's ride in a donkey. There's a purpose, because back in the prophet Zechariah, he wrote this in Zechariah chapter 9. He said, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. For behold, your king is coming to you, righteous. He's going to do what is right. He's going to make all things right. Things that were wrong, things that were broken, things that were busted, things that were false and untrue. He's going to make all things right. He's righteous. And he is your salvation. You were lost, and you were dying, you were persecuted, you're suffering. He is going to free you. He is going to save you. He's going to deliver you. He is humble, and he's mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." As Jesus entered Jerusalem with all those palm fronds, he was trying to show the people that he is the Messiah. He is the righteous one who will make things right. He is the just who will judge and bring about God's good and perfect will and purpose. He is our salvation. He is the Messiah, the King who has come to establish his throne and kingdom. What were the people expecting? I think they're expecting something to happen in the here and in the now. I think they're expecting that Jesus was going to establish his kingdom then and there. He was going to run those Romans out of town, but we've all heard that before. I think sometimes that's maybe a little too simplistic, a little too corporate. Because Jesus didn't come just to save a nation, just to save a kingdom or establish a kingdom, but Jesus came for the individual. Jesus came for each person whom he created, whom he loved, whom he knew needed him. He came to save each one that cries out for help. Now, my question to you is, what are you expecting? when you see Jesus, when you read about who he is and what he has done, what do you expect of him? What do you expect of him? The prophet Isaiah said, there shall come forth, there shall sprout forth this sprout of Jesse, this new growth that's going to be totally fruitful. And eventually, his resting place, it's going to become glorious. The prophet Isaiah knew that he would come and that he would die. But the people didn't quite expect that. In the story of Christ's crucifixion, we read about the centurion. The centurion who was in charge of all the crucifixions there in Jerusalem. He's called a centurion because he has 100 men underneath his authority. Because he's proven his power, he's proven his authority, he's proven his loyalty to Caesar and to Pilate. He has charge of at least 100 soldiers, which is why he's called a centurion. Now, he was also in charge of all the crucifixions in that area. If any crucifixion messed up, who would be to blame? The centurion. He was in charge of all these guys that were in that area. I don't know how many soldiers they had in Jerusalem, but it said that centurions were charged with anywhere from 100 to 1,000, maybe even sometimes 2,000 people. But he was there at the cross. He was probably the one who actually had to thrust that spear into the side of Christ, or at the very least the one who made the decision to spear him instead of breaking his legs. He had seen death. He had crucified probably thousands. He was a man of war in battle. He had probably killed thousands all across the world. When he looked at Jesus, what did he see? What did he think? Did he think there was hope? Mary Magdalene. She lived up and around the Sea of Galilee. She had followed Jesus for some time. She had looked and in this world in which she lived, she had a terrible life. The scriptures say that she was filled with 7 evil spirits. She had been opened up to the occult, to have demonic spirits within her, indwelling her. Who knows what other activities she had been engaged in. But as she came to Jesus, she knew that there was some real hope. She knew the difference between her life before she met Jesus and the suffering and the pain that she endured. And now that Jesus had come, now that he had sprung forth into her life, he had freed her from that past. He had freed her from her pain. She realized his power, his compassion, the way in which he dealt with her rightly. Mary Magdalene probably grew up in a Christian community or a Christian home, but eventually fell away. I don't know to what extent she may or may not have believed in God, but she had felt that the things of this world, there were answers there, and so she began to pursue those things and open herself up to a past life that most would be ashamed of to admit that they ever lived. And yet, she followed Jesus. She followed him to the cross. She saw him die. The Apostle Peter. Apostle Peter, he grew up probably in a more faithful way, in a more faithful manner. He probably wanted to find a rabbi, but he was too busy fishing and making a living with his brother and his family. He probably grew up in a community loving the Lord and loving his word, which is why he was so excited when this rabbi, this teacher from Capernaum, came and said, "Follow me." And he dropped his nets, he gave up his livelihood, and he devoted himself to serving God and His Word, and to follow this man called Jesus from Nazareth. He walked with him all across the land of Israel, listening to his teaching, obeying his commands. But then when push came to shove, when his faith was really put to the test, when Jesus was being tortured and whipped and dragged to the cross, Peter denied him 3 times. He turned his back on Jesus. He stumbled as he tried to follow, and he turned away. He had experienced everything that Jesus had to offer, and yet for a while he turned his back. And then we have Mary, a faithful mom. It's not, oh, I know what happened. There we go. A faithful mom who from the time that her boy was in her womb, she knew that there was something special. She was a righteous woman who followed the Lord. She wasn't perfect, as some like to portray her, but she loved the Lord from before Jesus was born. And she knew that God had a plan and a purpose. And when she buried her son, what was she expecting? Did she still have the hope? Maybe you're going about your own life. Maybe you're going about your own life in pursuit of your own ambitions and your own dreams. Maybe, like that centurion, you've risen to a rank and a place and a position that you've worked hard to get to. You maybe haven't given Jesus much thought. Maybe you're doing your own thing, you're pursuing your own goals and objectives, and they're not inherently bad or evil in and of themselves, but you haven't necessarily given Jesus a second thought. Maybe you're like Mary Magdalene. Maybe you feel like you're damaged goods, like you have a past, and how could God forgive you? How could anyone love you? If they only knew the things that you have done, the things that you don't want anybody to know about. And you wonder, how could God love you? How could God heal you? Maybe you're like Peter, and you did your part, you've been faithful, you've done your thing, you've attended church for years, but you're not quite sure that this Jesus thing is really real. When push comes to shove and the rubber meets the road, it's a little bit more challenging and difficult. Maybe you haven't seen the fruit that you had hoped would be produced. Maybe you're beginning to doubt and to wonder, is Jesus really the one? Is His church really the place where He's going to accomplish His purpose? Or maybe you're like Mary, Jesus' mother. Maybe you've been faithful for years and you keep praying for your family and your friends, and you know that Jesus is the real deal. He is the King of Kings, but there's so much pain that you're beginning to wonder. There's so many circumstances that it's just feeling like there's a cloud. What will make a difference? Well, I just want to encourage you this week. This is a great week to look at Jesus more closely. Jesus came to bring hope, but sometimes in our own life circumstances, it's hard for us to see beyond. It's hard for us to see past the present suffering, the present pain, the present clouds. And yet, as we're going to discover next week, all 4 of these people, plus more, discovered more fully the new beginning that Jesus gives to us when we just truly look to Him and depend on Him. You see, sometimes we think, oh, everything's going to be, we can just hit Control-Alt-Delete, and that in a flash, everything's going to be changed and fixed, and it'll just all be up and running the way everything is supposed to be. But I think that Jesus takes a little more time to work in our lives. It's a little bit slower process, which is why we need to look back. We need to see, how has He worked in other people's lives? Did God really fulfill the promises that He set forth from the prophets, even to today? will Jesus move and work and continue in our lives to draw us and to remake us, to give us that new start. I just want to encourage you that this is just the beginning of that new start.